Okay, this chapter is on activity-based costing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of just an introduction to activity-based costing and what a plant-wide overhead rate is. And so first thing, overhead is what we're mainly talking about as the main focus of this chapter. So we want to look at how do we allocate our overhead. We can't just wait till the end of a period and just say, okay, all this overhead needs to go, past to what we had manufactured before, what we made before. Instead, what we do is when we start a time frame, we usually try and estimate what the overhead is going to be, and then we allocate it as we go. Now, we can do this in a broad perspective called a plant-wide overhead rate or a predetermined overhead rate. Or we can do this more narrowed down, which would be activity-based costing, where we break things down into individual activities and then allocate based on those activities individually, which is inherently more accurate, but also more time-consuming. Anything we do in accounting, we always have to look at, how much time does it take and does it yield enough benefit to, make that cost of our time worth it. So the formula for a plant-wide overhead rate is plant-wide overhead rate equals the total budgeted factory overhead divided by the total plant-wide allocation base. That sounds really complicated, but really we're going to have a budget of some kind that shows all of our overhead. And then we're going to have an allocation base they're going to have to give us. Now, that allocation base could be a lot of things. It could be machine hours. It could be direct labor hours. It could be, number of times we use a particular machine. It could be a lot, like it could just be anything that drives that activity. It would be anything that actually drives, or at least that we believe accurately measures the allocation of that overhead. So whatever measures the allocation most accurately, or the most accurate measurement we can use, is what we should use for our activity base. But in these problems, we'll look at whether they're going to give you the activity base. So that makes it nice and straightforward. But in the real world, you'd want to find whatever you think most accurately represents where those costs come from, where those costs are derived from, and how you can most accurately allocate those costs based on those specific activities. So this company, Salty Sensations Snacks, manufactures 3 types of snack foods: tortilla chips, potato chips, and pretzels. The company has budgeted the following costs for the upcoming period. So we have factory depreciation, indirect labor, factory electricity, indirect materials, selling expenses, and administrative expenses. So first, it says the factory overhead is allocated to these 3 products on the basis of processing hours, and it says the products have the following production budget and processing hours per case. So the first thing it says is to determine the single plant-wide factory overhead rate. So what I need to do is I need to go through this list and figure out what's overhead. Factory depreciation is overhead. Indirect labor is overhead. Factory electricity is overhead. Indirect materials is overhead. Selling expenses is exactly what it's labeled. A selling expense is not overhead, and administrative expenses are also not overhead. So now I need to find, to use my formula here, I need to find the total budgeted factory overhead. So the total budgeted factory overhead, I'm just going to add 31,600 plus 78,400 plus 78,440 plus 35,400, and that's all my overhead. $153,000 is my total overhead. So now I found the top part of my function, the total factory overhead. Now I need to figure out what my allocation base is. The factory is allocated on the basis of processing hours. So the product said the following. Okay, so I need to find my total budgeted processing hours. I don't have that, but I can figure it out. So if I know that I'm going to make 4,000 cases of tortilla chips and each one takes me 0.2 of a processing hour, then I'm going to multiply those 2 together. That means I approximate 800 hours for the tortilla chips. And same thing for these 3. I would take 5,000 times 0.15 to get this 750, and 2,500 times 0.4 to get this 1,000. So those are my budgeted hours, budgeted processing hours specifically, which is, in this case, is my allocation base. So now I've got my total allocation base of 153 divided by, so I can take my total budget overhead divided by my allocation base of 25.50 for $60. This is my plant-wide overhead rate. Now it says use the rate in A to determine the amount of total per case factory overhead allocated to each of the 3 products under the generally accepted accounting principles. Now it's asking per case, so I could easily do the total by simply taking 60 times each one of these. Okay, and then obviously I could just divide by the number of cases. Another method I could use is just to divide that 60 by the number of hours. Since this is per hour, if it's 0.2 of an hour, then 0.2 of 60 is how much I would allocate. So I'm gonna do it the long way just to make it a little more visually kind of easy to see. So the total so my hours, and then I'm gonna put my rate, and then total allocated, and then per case. So I'm just kind of rebuilding the spreadsheet I already have, I know, but just to make this make a little more sense. So total number of hours already figured. For tortilla chips is 800, for pretzels and potato chips 750 and 1000. My rate is going to be the 60 for all of them. So my total cost allocated to tortilla chips is going to be 800 times 60 and 750 times 60 and so on and so forth. And the total of these should equal my 153,000 if I've done it right, and it does. The total of those does equal 153,000. Oh wait, it doesn't work. Equals. So if I want to know how much I'm going to allocate per case, I could simply take the 48,000 divided by the number of cases. So $12 per case for the tortilla chips, $9 per case for the potato chips, and $24 per case for the pretzels. We'll stop there for now.